my god, that's hard on the abs. I haven't really talked fashion much on this channel. I love fashion, I love horror. Put them together, what do you get? The fashion of horror. So that is what we're doing today. Exploring costuming and clothing in horror films through the ages. And we're going to start with one of the most visually iconic and recognizable creatures of cinema. The vampire. Based on my research and analysis, I would say that there are 5 prominent costume categories when it comes to on-screen vampires. Dracula, glampires, the cool vamp, the sexy lady, and the bloodsucker who blends in. As for this last category, these are costumes where the main purpose is to seem just like a normal human. And as much as I would like to talk about Twilight, specifically what drugs the casting director was on when they hired Michael Sheen, from here on out, I'm gonna ignore this category. It exists and that's relevant, but I don't have a huge amount to say about their Uniqlo sweaters and sensible trousers. And disclaimer, I don't watch other people's videos when I make my own to make sure that I'm not regurgitating other people's work, but that inevitably means I will have missed some things that might seem really obvious to other people. I've linked my own resources below if you want to look into anything further. I had so much fun writing this video, so I really hope you get something out of it. Before we break down each vampire archetype and its influences, I want to start with some of the common denominators in on-screen vampire costuming. Vampires are almost always given a distinct appearance on screen. Their look needs to communicate that these otherwise human-looking beings are not like us. And this is often why we get things like the striking overall appearance of albinism, abnormally long nails, or red eyes. These traits tell the audience that the character is alien, long before the spiky teeth come out to play. Costume specifically plays a huge part in establishing their mythos beyond these physical traits. And one costume trend we tend to see is either going really minimal or really maximal. I think this comes from the same place of establishing that the characters are unlike normal people. A dark color palette is one of the most common vampire staples, although we will look at some examples that stray from this. I think the most simple reason for this is that it reminds audiences that the character is evil. It's a simple visual equation. We relate dark colors to mystery, nighttime, and danger, because if you're in a dark alley trying to sneak up on someone, you're not going to wear a bright orange puffer vest. Costumes in blacks, greys, and browns show us that the vampires are one with the darkness, physically and metaphorically. Similarly to the dark color palette, coats and robes help vampires blend in with the night and protect them from sunlight and prying eyes during the day. This also has its origins in Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, where he describes his Dracula as having a cloak spreading around him as if they were great wings. As the literary character Dracula can turn into a bat, it makes sense that the animal's form is alluded to in his outfits. Interestingly, the big collar has its origins in theatre. When Bram Stoker's Dracula novel was adapted for the stage, the pointy collar was designed to conceal the actor's head from behind so that he could slip out of the coat and through a trapdoor, creating the illusion that he had disappeared out of the blue. The magic of editing in movies meant that the Dracula collars were no longer a necessity, but by the time book went to screen, it had already become part of the recognizable look. Outside of Dracula specifically, I think collars also provide some nice symbolism by concealing and inadvertently drawing attention to the neck. Vampires love necks, and as the sexiest access point to human veins, they know the value in protecting it. Hot take? Possibly, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some legitimate costume design reasoning in that. Even as on-screen vampires change and evolve, features like the cape, cloak, or long coat remain distinct to the character's iconography. And now, we have already mentioned him a few times, you know his name. Let's get on to our first archetype, and possibly our most famous vampire of all time, Dracula. I promise I'm not going to do that at the end of every section. Bram Stoker's Dracula takes place in 1890s England, and the character himself is a wealthy man, which obviously has a pretty big impact on the way that he is costumed in direct adaptations. As far as we know, the first on-screen appearance of Dracula is in 1921's Dracula's Death. Dracula's Death often gets overlooked in discussions of on-screen Draculas, especially because Nosferatu, which was released a year after in 1922, has had a much more lasting impact, particularly in establishing a now well-known vampire aesthetic. Is this a classless way to lie? The German Expressionism classic actually got in quite a bit of trouble for adapting the IP without permission, changing a few characters' names and details here and there, but it is considered to be an unofficial retelling of Count Dracula's story. There's unfortunately very little information on Nosferatu's production and specifically on its costume design, but we can see where the German film has taken from Bram Stoker's own descriptions of his beloved vampire. Stoker describes Dracula as a tall, thin, pale man with pointy ears and long teeth dressed only in black. The film's art director and costume designer Albin Grau skipped out on the white hair and long moustache described in the novel and opted for a hairless Nosferatu, giving him a far less human appearance overall. He wears a dark suit with fitted trousers and disproportionately broad shoulders, creating his unnatural shape. Permanently looming silhouette is a great example of the bold, distorted shapes found across German Expressionism. We can see in these stills that there's actually a lot of detailing in Nosferatu's costume, but the overall effect is just of a shadowy figure skulking around in the night. While information about the costume design, and the film for that matter, is little known, it's without a doubt had a huge influence on the way that vampires have been costumed over the last 100 years. In 1924, the first stage adaptation of Dracula saw the character in a tuxedo and white shirt, deviating from Stoker's all-black description. Supposedly the actor Raymond Huntley provided his own costume, his jazzy little tux reflecting the evening wear of wealthy men in both the 1890s and the 1920s, and clearly illustrating to those even in the back row that Dracula was a man of stature and sophistication. 1931's Dracula put this look to screen, making it famous world over, and this has really remained the most recognizable vampire archetype. For all the other categories that follow, if you were to turn up to a Halloween party in a suit and high-collared robe, people are going to know what you're dressed as. I went to Halloween a few years ago as Vanessa Redgrave from The Devils, and I hand-sewed my own costume, and needless to say, no one had any idea who I was, and I honestly just felt ugly and stupid. Sometimes we pay the price for trying too hard to be niche. As the first Dracula film in colour, correct me if I'm wrong, Dracula 1958 is another evolution of its on-screen predecessors. The white shirt is subtle, only noticeable around the collar, but it was able to introduce a flash of red in the lining of his cape, an obvious nod to blood. From here on, the 70s saw an onslaught of on-screen Draculas, which mostly fell into the suit and cape archetype. Through the 2000s, it's remained a classic style of vampire costuming, from Van Helsing to Netflix's Dracula, and most recently 2023's Renfield, where the costuming takes clear inspiration from the centuries' worth of cinematic Draculas before it. And then, of course, there is my favourite iteration of Dracula, the Count. Many other vampire films, not Dracula-specific, have called back to this traditional look. One of my favourite examples is Marlowe in 30 Days of Night. His white shirt, black coat, and even the way his hair lies, referencing the tuxedoed Dracula. We also see this in Blade, where the Reaper's shabby, ill-fitted dark clothing adds to their Nosferatu-like appearance. And the Vampires of American Horror Story's double feature specifically mimic the exaggerated shoulders of Nosferatu with huge blazes, creating the same unnatural proportions. We've seen Nosferatu's specific look repeated a few times, and the overall silhouette and idea is mimicked a lot when wanting to allude to vampirism without getting too creature-featurey. It's for this reason that I have A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night in this category, which might sound a bit silly, but the contrast of the pale face and black chador creates a similar overall effect, which I think is totally comparable, if not intentional. The main difference here being her visible striped t-shirt, which keeps the costume feeling contemporary and realistic. Now, this is probably the broadest category visually, but if we focus on the intangible qualities, it's like cool, trendy, and nonchalant. Spanning the high fashion vampires in The Hunger and the kind of punk adjacent vamps in The Lost Boys. Generally here we're looking at the dark, low contrast color palette, leather jackets, and sunglasses. Whether they're sleek or a little rough around the edges, they're basically vampires that would look right at home in Berlin. I say this as someone who has never been to Berlin. Cool vampires emerged in the 80s, appearing in films both made and set in that decade. And what made the aesthetic stand out is that it reflected the trends of its time. Dracula always dressed well on account of being wealthy, but now vampires dress cool. Dress cool? Vampires dress cool. The grammar in that is awful. The Hunger, directed by Tony Scott, made and mostly set in 1983, was costumed by four-time Oscar winner Melina Coninero. Yves Saint Laurent... I can't take myself seriously when I try to pronounce things in French. Yves Saint Laurent also provided the costumes for Catherine Deneuve, as they were longtime collaborators. The outfits feature both sleek 80s runway tailoring, like striking shoulders and nipped-in waists, which in itself was borrowed from the 40s and adds a certain sense of formality and sophistication. But the costumes of The Hunger also feature 80s new wave elements, like funky little sunnies and leather blazers. These vampires are stylish and aspirational, clothed in a blend of couture and subculture. There is a back and forth between fashion and film. They are inspired by each other and both pull from history and fantasy, and it was inevitable that at some point a vampire movie would become a part of this cycle. The Hunger not only referenced and was influenced by fashion at the time, but has remained influential in high fashion spaces. 18 years after its release, the film was used as direct inspiration for Alexander McQueen's 7th collection, The Hunger. As someone who frequently played with eroticism and depravity in his work, McQueen was the perfect designer to reinterpret the cinematic vampires, and the collection featured translucent body molds, extreme cutouts, and sharp lines. While we're on McQueen, it's worth mentioning that the vampire aesthetic cropped up a few times in his career. The Horn of Plenty collection, though he never mentioned vampires as an inspiration, featured distinctly vampiric looks, with their blood-red lips and pale faces, Dracula-adjacent color story, and gothic influences. These feathered looks in particular share similarities in silhouette and texture with the poster for The Hunger, which makes me wonder if the film was still on his mind while working on this collection. Vampires saw a real shift across the next 2 decades. The Hunger brought vampires into the fashion sphere, and while its costumes were sleek and stylish, other 80s vampire offerings that coincided with a boom in teen films gave vampires a more youthful and punk-inspired look. These vampires weren't old men in suits. They were teens and 20-somethings in leather, biker jackets, chunky jewelry, mesh singlets, and jeans. Rugged, sexy, dirty, and dangerous. Sexy! Oh. In 1987's The Lost Boys, the vampire costumes mix new romantic staples and the emerging grunge style. During his transition into a creature of the night, our main man gets an earring, which would have had the kids in the playground telling you looked gay about 20 years later, but at this point in time, it symbolized rebellion and adolescent angst. The same year gave us the punk-western hybrid styling of Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark. While the film was nowhere near as popular as The Lost Boys, it helped solidify this edgy and disheveled look as something we associate with vampires. These vampires were nonconformists and therefore viewed by teen audiences as really fucking cool, man. 1998's Blade, the first of the trilogy, introduced another cool, now 90s adjacent aesthetic. While we do see a bunch of older vampires in simple suits, the new generation of careless, party-hard vamps sport underground rave gear contemporary to the time. More mesh, low-rise leather trousers and crop tees and tanks, almost all in black. Outside of the club, we see this film's main vampire crew wear boxy leather jackets and sunnies, with their leader Deacon Frost taking things in an even more grungy pop-punk direction in an all-black trench, unbuttoned shirt, and smudged eyeliner. Once again, these vampires look sexy and desirable, like they wouldn't let you into their party unless you knew the DJ. It actually came out before The Matrix, but shares some very similar styling, with Blade himself in a super 90s long leather coat, speed dealer sunnies, and utilitarian pieces fixed with metalware and harnesses. In all the above films, the way the characters dress could be replicated by audiences now and then without it seeming out of place. Would you wear this to the club? No. But would you wear this to the club? Absolutely. And you're probably going to get offered poppers. If you have seen any of my videos, you will know that I have a fondness for a gown and a frilly shirt. And it's for this reason that this vampire archetype is my personal favorite. The glampire costume is decadent and flouncy. Huge flowing robes in silks and satins, billowing blouses, heavily bejeweled garments, and accessories. The glampire look leans into romanticism, fantasy, and often 19th century European fashion. These bitches are camp, like red dress and a silver wig, singing in 11 languages while doing the splits. 1922's Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and costumed by Japanese-born Eiko Ishioka, has unparalleled costumes that breathe new life into the familiar tale. We've still got the recognizable suits, robes, and color palette, but Ishioka also brings in authentic elements of Eastern and European design to give it the familiar suits a much richer, old-world look, recognizably opulent across cultures, and making Dracula stand out in this Victorian world. Dracula's suit of armor is a totally new take on the character, drawing clear inspiration from wolves, samurai warriors, and the human anatomy, the ribbed pieces coming together like raw muscle. Coppola also showed Ishioka Byzantine art and specifically requested that Gustav Klimt's The Kiss, a work known for its intricate gold detailing, be translated into one of Dracula's costumes. It became the inspiration for his final outfit, in which he takes his rest. It's a stunning patchwork of gold, silver, and vibrant color, possibly also a reference to the idea of an accumulation of lives. Ishioka said of her designs, "My image of Dracula should have a million faces. It's almost like endless transformation." Along with Klimt, this final robe also resembles priestly vestments, changing our view of him from a night terror to a supernatural being finally seeking the light. This is one of the film's more discreet costumes, and Dracula's little sunnies always made me laugh because I thought they were so out of place, but it turns out people did wear sunglasses in the 1890s. And even this choice of accessory is purposeful. As this article by Linda Kodega for The Spool suggests, the sunglasses and mop of long shaggy hair allude to the look of rock and metal frontmen like Ozzy Osbourne, playing on pop culture satanic panic and hinting that beneath his tailored suit, Dracula is a dangerous man. In my opinion, the standout costume in this film is Lucy's wedding dress. And I'm so happy she's a vampire in this scene because it means I can include it shamelessly. It's intricate, unusual, inspired by a lizard, and pure white to represent her marriage and new birth. To me, Lucy in this scene is the ultimate glampire, embodying decadence and decay. Coppola famously said of his Dracula, "The costumes will be the set." He elaborated in this behind-the-scenes interview saying, "I was going to lead with the costumes. I was going to put most of my money in the costume, and I was going to diminish the sets." It's to this we can attribute why the costumes are so elaborate and luxe. They're there to paint the whole picture and stimulate the audience on a different level. A key influence of the vampire aesthetic is the time periods that the films take place in. Glampires tend to be found in period pieces up to around the early 1900s, I would say, and this is because the voluminous silk gowns and velvet waistcoats and ruffled blouses that we associate with glamour were actually worn between the 17 and 1900s. Only really by the extremely wealthy, but as on-screen vampires often get the wealthy Dracula treatment, they get to enjoy the best fashions that the Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassical, Regency, Victorian and Edwardian periods had to offer. As a great epic that takes place between 1790 and 1990, Interview with a Vampire really established the glamorous historical vampire trope in cinema, depicting vampires moving through history. Renowned costume designer Sandy Powell said that although the costumes aren't totally period accurate, that everything is right for the period in terms of cut and silhouette and feeling. So you could consider Lestat and Louis to be bloodsuckers that blend in, but it's the opulent historical period and class that they're blending in with that makes them glampires. This is just what the bros were wearing. For our two lead vampires, Powell didn't really go in the black, white, and red color combo direction. Instead, she put Lestat in deep navies, silver grays, and purples, which keeps his look dark but not stereotypical, and Louis in more earthy, faded colors to make him seem warm and humble. It's really subtle and really yummy use of color. Yummy is such a mum thing to say. Love it, darling. It's so yummy. They also contrast each other in character, as Lestat, who is self-indulgent, arrogant, and hedonistic, wears outfits that are more swanky and over the top. While still gorgeous, Louis' outfits tend to be a little simpler. You could think of Lestat as a dark, glistening night sky and Louis as an earthly landscape. What beautiful words that I have written. Shortly after Lestat turns Louis into a vampire, they attend a party and Louis is dressed in blue and gold. Of everything he wears, it's the costume that most resembles the glamorous Lestat, which to me says that Powell saw the gilded, intricately embroidered and glamorous look of Lestat as epitomizing the vampire. When Louis returns to his own colour palette, we're reminded of his humanness. Itty bitty Kirsten Dunst plays Claudia, a girl/woman/little lady who is bitten by Louis as a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old in the book, which is crazy. I can understand why they aged her up, for sure. Her costumes communicate her change from a child to a woman trapped in a child's body, going from Empire Line and baby doll dresses in delicate lace and chiffons to heavier velvet and silk gowns that emphasize a more womanly shape. She also often mimics Lestat's color palette and fondness for excess, which means we get to see her in some really stunning dresses which wouldn't actually have been worn by children of the period. Children of the period? American Horror Story Hotel, which is one of our more contemporary vampire examples, takes the same route of historical glamour. As we flash back to the Countess in various decades, her present-day 2015 costumes combine 80s trends and old Hollywood glam. So we get shoulder pads, blazers, driving gloves, chunky jewels, beautiful draping and wrap dresses in expensive fabrics. She's always put together, always glamorous. And of course, there are a few nods to a more stereotypical vampire look in the regular use of the black, white, and red color palette, veils, and capes. Particularly these two outfits feel reminiscent of The Hunger, which I'm sure is intentional. 2013's Only Lovers Left Alive has really been causing me trouble because their costuming throughout the film falls pretty 50-50 into two extremes. The costume designer looked to the cool vamps, looked to the glampires, and said, ¿Por qué no las dos? When they're out and about, we see Adam and Eve in the now recognizable combination of sunglasses and leather jackets, simple and understated, because as designer Bina Daigler described, the vampires don't really care about the clothes. While Daigler said that she was avoiding the look of any specific time period, I do feel the costumes have a low-key rock and roll aesthetic that I associate with the early 2000s, an influence that perhaps didn't feel obvious at the time we were living it. And all of that stuff I'd throw in the cool vamp category. But it's when they lounge in their homes that Adam and Eve's costumes give away their true identity. These clothes, pulled from many cultures, traditions, and time periods, hint at the long lives lived by Adam and especially Eve. From her Middle Eastern headscarves to intricately embroidered Chinese silk pajamas. While Adam takes on the traditional black color palette, we see Eve in a lot of whites and yellows. This gives her a more angelic appearance, encouraging the audience to consider her grace, kindness, and intelligence. While they're still killers, these vampires are philosophical and contemplative, not creepy, violent, or unruly. At various points in the film, they do both wear this bedrobe, which feels like the most blatant traditional vampire reference, with its pinstripe often seen in men's formal wear and its oxblood red velvet cuffs. They wear it at their most disheveled, which I think is a nice way to show that particularly Eve's elegance can still be worn down, and beneath there will always be a vampire. While not overtly glamorous in the way that some of the other costumes in this category are, these costumes with their embroidery, beading, expensive fabrics, and rich colorways nod to the decadence of historic vampire costumes. Da 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 da. Oh my god, she was a sexy vampire the whole time. Alright people, moving on to something more controversial. I feel like I had a very strong image of the sexy vampire in my head. But when researching this, I found that there were far fewer examples than I thought. And I think that's because they make more appearances in TV and cheap exploitation films, past and present. But of the examples I did find, I think there is a distinct look, often having markers of historical and fantasy clothing, like jewels, chiffon, and elaborate headdresses. Basically, they take the elements of better costumed films with more artistic value and boil them down to bikinis. While I can't say I'm the biggest fan of these specific ways costume designers have molded our image of the sexy vampire, purely in concept, they do make sense. A vampire's bloodlust often means that they are battling temptation, and temptation, being tempted by the human body, is something that we associate with taboo, desire, and ultimately sex. The consumption of another living human is as carnal as it gets, which I would say is inherently erotic. So the idea is good, but the way that they've been costumed leaves a lot to be desired, especially in the early 2000s goth fantasy boom, if we can call it a boom. Did it really boom? Boom. Say boom again. Boom. And I'm no prude. Potentially problematic roots aside, are they slaying most of the time? Yes. But were these costumes designed so that teenage boys would buy movie tickets in the hopes of seeing boobs for the first time? Also yes. The sexy vampire also, often in costume only, has a non-Western look, whether that be Eastern European, Middle Eastern, or Asian. I think this happens for a few reasons. Sometimes these origins are relevant to the idea that vampires are from ancient or unfamiliar lands, and leaning away from Western styling feels less familiar to British and American audiences. But I think a lot of the time, perhaps subconsciously, it plays on the over-sexualized trope of exotic, non-white women. Over-sexualizing women of color has deep historical roots, and it's all pretty icky. I will link some stuff in the bio if you want to understand more about that. One sexy vampire that stands out from the rest is Akasha, the vampire queen in 2002's Fall of the Damned, which, if you didn't know, is the only official sequel to Interview with the Vampire. It also sadly was the last project that Aaliyah worked on before her very tragic death. The film was costumed by Oscar-winning Australian costume designer Angus Strathy. And is it a coincidence that the only male costume designer so far on this list gave us a bedazzled bikini? Yeah, kind of. The film is based on Anne Rice's novel of the same name, and the character's origins go all the way back to the late 3000 BCs, where she was born in Uruk, modern-day Iraq, and then lived in Egypt. Producer Jorge Saralagui explained that Akasha's costume was inspired by this ancient time period, as it's when she went to sleep before being awoken again in the 80s, when the film is mostly set. The other vampires featured in the film, known as the Ancients, were all costumed in accordance to the times and places that they went to sleep and then rose again. So there's a mixture of ancient and contemporary clothing. Our lead vampire Lestat is dressed in glam rock / grunge attire because he's now in a rock and roll band. Having been made in 2001, Akasha's costumes seem to combine elements of supposed 3000s BC clothing with early 90s and 2000s pop icon style, which in itself was sometimes influenced by the East and the Middle East. Think Britney Spears and her snake. Ow. The most noticeable contemporary features are the very low-waisted, tummy-bearing silhouettes, which was a popular look in the late 90s and early 2000s, and something Aaliyah sported lots on red carpets herself. This super low-waisted look is really re-entering popularity currently, and I've got to say, I can't do it. I have a lot of digestive issues. My stomach is bloated like 80% of the day, every day. Not happening on this channel. Catch me in like 6 months wearing it because it's cool and I don't want to feel left out. But I digress. I couldn't find any evidence of the novel calling for an itty-bitty metal bikini, but there's some evidence historically that women might have worn some pretty exposed outfits in Africa and the Middle East. And at the end of the day, it's an early 2000s erotic vampire film. So I can understand how we got here, and the final result is undeniably sumptuous. All right, let's wrap this thing up. The fashion of the vampire is both broad and easily recognized, which I think is an amazing feat. Amazing foot, amazing feet. Oh no. You know your jokes are bad when your camera doesn't even want to film them. Even in real world clothing, if you want to look sexy, you put on a red lip unknowingly referencing a bloody mouth and a black dress alluding to your aloofness. Colloquially, this look is known as vampy. It's a well understood image. And as for the true markers of what makes a vampire look like a vampire on screen, I think it's the sentiment of wealth, indulgence, and sophistication, or on the other end of the scale, ugliness, danger, and decay, that binds vampire costumes into one recognizable group across the board. Coats and dark colors or references to them, I think, are also significant enough to get the official stamp. In modern vampire cinema, we recently had The Invitation, which stayed pretty close to the traditional suited and sleek dark vampire aesthetic. Other more recent examples like American Horror Story The Last Voyage of Demeter and Renfield have also mostly referenced the original on-screen Dracula or Nosferatu image. Especially with Robert Eggers' Nosferatu on the way, which again appears to be going down a more traditional route, I don't get the sense that we're getting a new wave of vampires with a distinct aesthetic in the 2020s. Culturally, we have solid associations between the vampire costuming archetypes and wealth or sexiness or danger, so it doesn't seem like there's a reason to implant a new aesthetic onto our existing understanding of them. The best vampire costumes develop something fresh and distinct while still drawing from the creature's rich literary and cinematic history. We've seen some incredible examples of this in the past. We know what works, but I am hopeful that someone or something will shake things up and bring on the next era of innovative vampire costume design. And that is that. I have to dash because I'm late for a baseball game with my boyfriend's family, but I really hope you enjoyed today's costume/film/fashion exploration. I already have a bunch more of these planned for various other horror creatures and characters. Stick around and I'll see you soon. Go. You know those old like romance novels?
I need more neck. Hold up.
I don't have more neck.